I'm getting ready to change the filter and flush the old fluid out of my power steering pump in this 1980 300 SD, and I'm not, and I'm going to repeat, I'm not going to be using ATF. And you're going to go, what, Kent? How come you're not going to use automatic transmission fluid? Isn't that what Mercedes recommends? In fact, isn't that what you've recommended over the years on your website? And I have to confess, yes, that's true. But let me explain. There's a few things that have been happening over the last 5 years that have led me to come to believe that it's not a good idea anymore to use Dexron 3 or the equivalent in these older power steering units. Now, let me explain something. How many of you have owned one of these cars and have complained about how rapidly the steering boxes wear out? You've got 150,000 miles on your 300D, and you go down the freeway and you're moving the wheel about 1.5 inches to 2 inches before you get any steering movement. This seems to be common all over the world. So what do you think is causing premature wear in the steering box? Whoops. Could it be the fluid? All right. Just think about it. Many of those models produced after 1986 were not using automatic transmission. They were using power steering fluid, a specialty power steering fluid formulated for reduced wear. And a lot of shops, particularly shops that rebuild the power steering boxes, are reporting the same thing. They're seeing excessive wear, much more so in those older boxes that were using ATF than the ones that are using power steering fluid. And I know right away some of you are thinking, well, Kent, why would Mercedes do that? You know, why would they recommend a fluid that would cause premature wear on the box? It's not so much the pump. That doesn't seem to be the problem. The other problem I see is rotting low-pressure hoses, and I sometimes wonder whether ATF is causing some of the premature failure of the hose. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I don't see quite so many hose failures on those models, 1986 and newer, that are using power steering fluid. So you kind of know where I'm going with this. I actually set out my New Year's resolution for 2016 is to get all my models in here and flush them out. Get rid of the ATF and put this Febby Bilstein power steering fluid. Now, if I have a newer model, let's say up into the mid-90s, and it's a very low mileage car, I am putting synthetic power steering fluid in it. And you may say, well, why don't you put synthetic in all of them? Well, you have to kind of make a judgment call there. If you have an old box, if you have a car with, 150 to 250,000 miles, you want to stick with power steering fluid. It's a little bit thicker, and the viscosity will prevent the leaks coming out of the seals in the box. So it's kind of your call. I'm not saying synthetic is bad for the real old models, but you have to be a little careful. The important thing is to get rid of the ATF and put in power steering fluid. Now, some of you will say, well, Ken, I've read on the forums that you can just go into any old auto parts store and just use that cheap power steering fluid that you get across the counter or on the shelf. And people will put this in the forums. They'll say, oh, I've used this cheap power steering fluid, $3 a quart, and it works just fine. Well, how do they know it works just fine over the long haul? How do they know? Sure, the car's going to drive fine. It's kind of like saying on a diesel here that, hey, I go to this forum and I ask, what kind of oil should I use for my engine? Somebody comes on and says, you don't need to buy that expensive oil. You can just buy that cheap, recycled, non-detergent oil that you can pick up in the 5-gallon buckets. And I put it in my diesel and it runs fine. You see what the point I'm trying to make here? Just because someone's saying he's using something and it works fine, that doesn't necessarily mean it works fine, or it's going to be good for the engine or the component where he's using the fluid. You really have to be careful. And besides this, come on, how many times are you going to be flushing your power steering fluid? Maybe once every 30 to 40,000 miles? And if you have to pay like $10 or $12 more for a couple of liters of really good high quality power steering fluid that has the anti-wear additives in it, well, that's your call, okay? I think that's kind of false economics. Coming back to this ATF, one thing you have to realize is over the last 20 years, automatic transmission fluid has gone through an evolution. And some of the properties in the current ATF that's compatible for Dexron 3 applications doesn't have the same stuff in it that the old Dexron 3 has. Look at this. This is an old bottle I have from about 15 years ago. And it actually says Dexron 3. But the stuff you get now is kind of different. It's like an MD3, and of course you read the back, it says, oh yeah, formulated for automatic transmissions, 2005 and older. So it's formulated, but it's not the same thing. And I think that's part of the problem. You're not getting the same type of automatic transmission fluid that you were 20 years ago. So because of those factors, this is what I'm recommending. In fact, I'm highly admonishing you to consider getting rid of the ATF in your power steering unit and putting in a quality approved power steering fluid. Now, we carry the Febby Bilstein fluid on my website, and I'm going to have a complete kit that'll have hose and some clamps and a plug and some other things that you'll need to be able to do this flush successfully. We'll also include a filter in the kit, but I'm going to include video instructions that you'll get for free if you buy the kit. And I'm going to once again highly recommend that this year, 2016, get that old ATF out of your power steering systems.